Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
One seasoned Russia watcher wrote yesterday, someone in Downing Street calculated that it was less embarrassing to suppress the Intelligence and Security Committee's report into Russian interference in the UK than it was to publish it. This is obviously the opinion of Oliver Bullock writing in yesterday's Guardian, but it rather focuses the mind on a question that I suspect many people are hoping we will stop asking. A certain type of right-wing authoritarian used to contend almost daily that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, which makes one wonder what it is they have to fear or indeed hide about the contents of this report. Given that we can't actually get our hands on it, we will this morning spend half an hour or more talking to people either associated with it, deeply concerned about it, or, in the case of one of my guests, with a profound academic overview of all of the attendant issues. This is important. It is important because a 50-page report full of revelations, reportedly, about rich Russians funding political parties and associating with politicians, as well as Russian bots meddling in the referendum, could, of course, have a profound impact upon proceedings between now and December the 12th. I'm joined by Bill Browder, who is a tireless campaigner against what we'd have to loosely describe as Vladimir Putin's kleptocracy, a mission upon which he embarked after his own lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was effectively murdered in jail by Putin cronies. I'm joined on Facebook Live by Ian Lucas, a former Labour MP and a member not of the Intelligence and Security Select Committee, but of the Culture of Media and Sport Select Committee. They've already looked at some elements that we expect to be reflected within the other Select Committee's report that we're not allowed to see. And a little later, we'll talk to Professor Philip Davis, who is the director of the Brunel Centre for Intelligence and Security Studies, also the author of a book on the Intelligence and Security Committee, who says that the report would have serious implications for the upcoming election. So I'll begin with you, Bill, but I'm conscious that we've got Ian Lucas looming over us on a screen in the background. So you gave evidence to this committee. Obviously, we're sort of bound slightly by parameters of secrecy and reportage, but perhaps we could begin by asking why they wanted to talk to you.
I'm one of the people who has been at the sort of tip of the spear of fighting with Vladimir Putin, and I should say Vladimir Putin fighting with me. I was the person who got a piece of legislation passed here in the UK, the United States, Canada, and other countries called the Magnitsky Act, which imposes asset freezes and visa bans on Vladimir Putin. He hates me. He's been coming after me in all sorts of different ways, with death threats, with kidnapping threats, with Interpol red notices, extradition requests.
You have, I mean, just for people who aren't familiar with you or your mission, for example, tweeting from the back of a Spanish police car that you'd been arrested as a result of an Interpol warrant. It was essentially effected without due diligence or scrutiny because Interpol sort of followed the dots that Putin had laid.
Well, worse than that, I was invited to Spain by the chief anti-corruption prosecutor to give him evidence on Russian organized crime and money laundering connected to the murder of my lawyer. I have a meeting with him at 11 a.m. on the 30th of May last year. And I'm coming out of my hotel room, and a different division of the Spanish police, acting on a Putin-Russian Interpol red notice, arrest me. And fortunately, they didn't take my phone away, and I live tweeted the whole thing. And you know, people criticize Twitter, and we're probably going to do a little bit of that today. But this is one of these situations where people went crazy when they heard that I was being arrested. And by the time I got to the police station, 50 journalists had called Interpol, 50 more had called the Spanish Interior Minister, 50 more had called Boris Johnson. And I was released after 2 hours. But had it not been for Twitter and my ability to live tweet that, I'd probably a year later be sitting in a Spanish jail on my way to Russia to be killed in prison.
Which gives an indication of how high the stakes are. I mean, if we were to just neatly distill the key point of the Magnitsky legislation, it would be simply to stop people who have filled their pockets with ill-gotten gains in post-perestroika Russia from spending and washing or laundering that money in the West. So you were asked questions, presumably, about some Russian oligarchs and the infiltration or wooing of British political figures?
Well, so it was interesting. The question I was asked by the Intelligence and Security Committee, and this was more than a year ago, they came to me and they said, could you discuss Russian government spying operations in the UK? And my response in writing, I wrote a 14-page of evidence with names, dates, documents, etc. And my response was, you're kind of focusing on the wrong thing, because yes, Russia sends in their official spies under diplomatic cover who are employees of the government, but there's a much bigger problem in this country, which is that Vladimir Putin has created a class of people who have been allowed to steal from other people, steal from the state, and become immensely wealthy. They're called the Russian oligarchs. And those Russian oligarchs who have become wealthy are then called on by Putin to go and do government work. And here's where the story gets really twisted and horrible, is that these Russian oligarchs then come to the UK, and then they employ ex-security service people, members of the House of Lords, political operatives at the highest level, to do their intelligence work, to do their influence work, and to do basically working for the Kremlin. And so you basically have British people doing the dirty work of Putin here for money.
To what end?
To benefit Vladimir Putin, and for their end, for money.
I mean, these are fairly sweeping allegations. Obviously, we're not naming names, but the report presumably does name names.
I name a lot of names.
I'm sure you do, but I don't think you can today.
I'm not going to today. I understand your constraints. Everyone's got their hands tied behind their backs here, and that was one of the reasons why the report was so interesting, because the report, under parliamentary privilege, they can name the names and nobody will be sued.
Precisely.
And the report should have come out, and the report would have named names, and had it named names, a lot of people would be really unhappy.
Why do you think it hasn't come out? Which is not a rhetorical question. I do want you to answer it.
Well. I mean, this is not a partisan thing, I should point out,
yes,
because I named labor names, I named conservative names, and so this is an issue of national security. And I've seen this before. This was not the first time we had a situation like this. I was asked in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee to name names. I submitted the names. I was testifying. They said, "You're making very serious allegations, Mr. Browder, and can you provide the names?" And I said, "Yes." I provided the names, and then for many months they wouldn't publish them, and they finally did. They redacted the names. I believe that there's a sort of unwritten code in this country, which is the establishment of this country. Everybody scratches each other's back, so nobody puts each other in a bad situation. I don't know what the political purpose of this was, but I can say that there's an aversion to getting to the bottom of this issue.
The official government response is that the process cannot be rushed. The information contained within the report is too sensitive for the public and must be redacted prior to publication. Ian Lucas, over to you. Of course, your interest in this began with your membership of a different committee, indeed a subcommittee of the Culture of Media and Sport Committee. But I hope you won't be offended when I say that you've really gone to town since announcing that you were stepping down as an MP, and you are, I mean, profoundly troubled is something of an understatement by the state of affairs. Why? Because you come at it from a slightly different angle from Bill Browder.
Well, Bill gave evidence to the DCMS Select Committee, and we produced two substantial reports in 2018 and 2019, where we did raise the issue of Russian disinformation in a huge amount of detail. And those reports are on the parliamentary website for your listeners to look at. And they disclose overwhelming evidence, in fact, accepted evidence, even by Theresa May, of interference by Russia in elections across the Western world, elections that we know have been accepted, have been interfered with in the United States. And what we've been trying to do, and what the cross-party committee called for in February of this year, was an independent inquiry into recent elections in the UK, because we believe that a very strong aspect of the interference that's taking place is interference online in our democratic process. And we believe our laws are inadequate to deal with this, and furthermore, that the political will to deal with this is inadequate. And this is why this report is being I don't know what's in it, but I know what's in the DCMS Select Committee report. And there's been a huge resistance, picking up on what Bill said, to interest in the detail of the report, in the the detailed evidence of Russian interference in elections here, going back to the 2014 independence referendum in Scotland, through to 2015, 2016 and 2017. And what we called for was an independent investigation into those elections to look at what has happened in the UK. And ever since we have done this, this government, the government which is now led by Boris Johnson, has resisted at every stage any investigation which looks at those elections, which of course leads us, and one of those elections, or it was the referendum in 2016, in which Boris Johnson was intimately involved in the Vote Leave campaign. Michael Gove was intimately involved too. Dominic Cummings was intimately involved. And in recent weeks and months, I've been raising in the House of Commons, I've been raising outside the House of Commons and in correspondence with Mr. Gove and Boris Johnson, these issues, and they have not rebutted any of the allegations that I've made against them. They've not answered the questions that I put to them, and they've avoided being held to account on their role in the Vote Leave campaign and the electoral offences, which is a matter of fact, were committed then. So there's a huge resistance to reopening this subject by the people who are now running the government in this country, and we desperately need answers from them at this time. So that's why I'm so interested in what's in this report. We had a lot of helpful evidence from people like Bill Browder and other security and intelligence people, some of which was in private to the committee, and a cross-party report which is very detailed and which is being looked at very closely across the world, is setting out what needs to be said. What's really interesting is you'll never guess the country that had the most responses to the report. Most of the people who looked at the report that the DCMS Select Committee produced were from Russia, more than from the UK. So this report stands up. It's not been challenged anywhere. It's accepted by every government in the world that we need to be looking at this issue except our own.
I sense you can't quite believe the lack of response to the work that your committee did. It's almost as if you thought you were lighting some blue touch paper, perhaps for want of a slightly less provocative simile, and yet the fireworks haven't gone off.
Well, what's extraordinary is that every day now we are seeing Michael Gove and Boris Johnson running around the country dealing with different issues in a general election campaign which they have instigated. But none of your colleagues are asking them about this. It is the case, to be fair to the BBC, that within the last 2 weeks, for the first time, I've been interviewed on the BBC concerning this issue. And it goes to the heart of whether the election that we're currently holding is actually is an honest election, whether the foundation of our democracy is something that we can rely on, and that the decision that we make on December the 12th is one that's fair and open. All of these issues are raised in our reports, and the government has been determined to avoid addressing them ever since we've raised the issue last year.
Ian, we'll return to you. We're going to take a short break. I should add that the government tell us they've seen no evidence of successful interference in the UK's democratic processes, and they say that far from being lenient with Russia, the UK has been at the forefront of calling Russia out and opposing its malign activity. Unfortunately, they've declined to let us talk to anybody directly, so I'm bound to just point out that they have seen no evidence of successful interference in the UK's democratic processes, but are simultaneously opposing its malign activity, which is an interesting position. It's 10:17. I'm joined by the human rights campaigner Bill Browder, by the former MP and member of the Select Committee for Culture, Media and Sport. More pertinently for our purposes this morning, the committee, of course, that was responsible for the disinformation and fake news reports. And now I'm joined also by Professor Philip Davis, who's a director of the Brunel Centre for Intelligence and Security Studies. You've written a book on the work of this committee, and you won't have heard the first 10 to 15 minutes of the programme, my other two guests essentially represent the two prongs of questions regarding this report. On the one hand, the oligarchs, if you like, the infiltration and the possibility that British political figures have somehow ended up in the pocket, I think we could say, could we, Bill, of Russian oligarchs, and the other as represented by Ian Lucas, which is more to do with the fake news, the online disinformation. Would it be reasonable to ask you which of those two prongs concerns you the most?
Neither of them.
Go on.
The area that concerns me, given the nature of my research centre, is the degree of hostile control of the activity, and specifically how it's being controlled by hostile agencies. So if you come along and say, well, you've got foreign individuals or commercial entities who might have an interest in influencing an election, that's okay, it's inappropriate, it's a problem, and one might put in statutory frameworks to limit the movement of foreign money and to influence an election. On the other hand, if you've got a clandestine organisation that's in the business of trying to manipulate elections or election processes below the radar, one, that's not going to be touched by a regulatory framework, so you can stick all the new laws in that you want.
Okay.
But if they're running through the old Soviet-style playbook of cutouts, agents of influence, front and cover organisations, then you're in a very limited armature. It has to be the ability to interrogate and penetrate and get into the clandestine machinery that runs that thing. And that's where I think our interest comes in. I think that's one of the reasons why the ISC report is so important. Because it's one thing to come along and say that the Russian oligarchs are trying to influence British elections. I'm sure there are lots of American businessmen who would like to influence British elections. And I'm sure there's lots of people here who would like to influence American elections.
It's not the who, it's the how.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And also the nature of the controls. It's again, if an oligarch wants to manipulate an election, that's one problem. If it is the central government of the Federal Russian Republic trying to manipulate British politics, and not only that, if you're trying to manipulate British politics in a way that cracks Britain out of part of what the Russians perceive as an integrated Western alliance of the EU plus NATO, then you're not just affecting British sovereignty, you're affecting and you're weakening wider strategic deterrence and security.
Good grief. And we were all concerned enough already before you arrived in the studio.
It is much worse than you think.
So that's nervous laughter for the tape. Would you tell me then why or how concerned you are or why you think this report is not being published? The official government statement to us tells us that they need longer to process it. There's things that need to be redacted. You know probably more about the workings of the ISC, the Intelligence and Security Committee, than almost anybody. I suppose I want to ask you whether you think that's a plausible response.
I'm imperfectly convinced. In a certain sense, the idea that it has to be laid before Parliament is a statutory requirement. So they could make the case that they're constrained by law. Now,
they haven't made that case.
No, what they have said in the Cabinet Office response to the Media and Sports Committee, that the Parliament is dissolved, so they can't lay it before Parliament, which might be using the letter of the law to defeat the spirit of the law. Now, Dominic Grieve has said firmly that he believes there's no statutory reason why they can't release it. So it might be in principle possible to release the report in advance of Parliament reconvening. And in any event, it's Prime Minister's authority of its release. Now, when he gets in the studio, I think it's one of the things you might want to ask him about, because the warp and weft of that particular aspect of the statute has changed in recent years, and I'm not necessarily as literate with the fine detailed new statute. So I don't see a credible reason why it can't be released.
He told me last week that the pre-publication process involved...
It's complete.
Well, and that is where anything that would need to be redacted for security issues would have been redacted. And I think he's been supported on that by former heads of the intelligence services themselves.
Well, if the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee says that all the agency approvals have gone through, then all the agency approvals have gone through.
Back to Bill Browder, because what Philip has reminded us of, or perhaps stressed even further, is the crucial nature of the links between the oligarchs and the Kremlin. Because it had slipped my mind, actually, that of course there are going to be people with large fortunes all over the world seeking to influence elections and influence politicians. You can't hardly imagine politics without it. Normally they're called lobby groups, or occasionally they're called think tanks. Very occasionally they're called educational charities. But this is quite different. This is. I mean, you tell us. This is the world in which you're mired.
Yeah, so one cannot separate oligarchs from the Russian government. They are one and the same. The oligarchs don't exist but for the Russian government. They become oligarchs because they've been sort of given a task to become rich so that they can do things for the Russian government. And so, and this is where we're in a new world now, where it used to be, spies working for the Russian government, on diplomatic cover. Now, it's all kind of in a big gray area, and we've seen this, and it's been documented where, for example, in the United States, there was this woman who was a lawyer for a Russian oligarch named Natalia Veselnitskaya, and on behalf of Putin, she went to Trump Tower to try to have the Magnitsky Act repealed, and this is what's going on here. And to make matters worse, Russian oligarchs, Russian government, whatever, but we have British citizens that are effectively selling out their country for money, taking it from these people to do Russia and Vladimir Putin's bidding. And that is where I find, and that can be legislated against. You don't have to have that.
And by bidding, I mean, it's a broad church that you describe, but loosely, the central aim of these people in this project is to allow them to hang on to their money. And the central aim of Magnitsky Acts in various different countries is to prevent named individuals from buying up huge swathes of real estate or big estates in Buckinghamshire or football clubs or newspapers.
Exactly. And what these people have done is they have hired British nationals of great stature, members of the establishment, to go out and try to stop the consequences of the natural process of law, the Magnitsky Law and other laws going after their money. And that's just wrong. I mean, if we've put these laws in place for national security reasons, and then you have a bunch of people who are members of the establishment that can go rub shoulders with their pals and say, well, you shouldn't do this. And those guys are getting money. These upper echelon people getting money from the Russians to do that. That's just wrong. And there's an easy way to fix that. You can say that it's illegal to lobby for if you're a member of the House of Lords, a member of Parliament, or a recent graduate of one of these institutions, you cannot lobby on behalf of foreign powers or foreign agents of foreign powers. And they have a law like that in America. It's called the FARA law, the Foreign Agent Registration Act.
I should add that the professor is nodding. Ian Lucas, back to you. I wonder if you could say a word to anybody listening to this programme who is sort of putting their tinfoil hat on and thinking, oh, don't be ridiculous, this is all a bit James Bond, this is all a bit woo. I mean, for my money, the testimony that we've heard from all three of you is persuasive and convincing, but we live in strange and sceptical times.
We do. I think what we need to do is look at the political place that the UK is in at the moment. Look at the catastrophic instability that we have and have had in politics in the UK for the period certainly since 2016, and the impact that's had on us being able to effectively function as a modern democracy. And contrast that with the huge amount of money that was spent by the then Soviet Union on tanks on the plains of Eastern Europe, and what impact that actually had on the UK over that period. We're in a very, very febrile and political time with a huge amount of division within our society. And we've had a number now of general elections, which as a practicing politician, I've seen have been taken over in many respects by online campaigns, and we're seeing that at the moment. And whilst I accept exactly what Philip is saying, as a practicing politician, politics has been transformed by online campaigning, and people are seeing this at the moment. And the involvement of Russia in online campaigning is a matter of fact, which is evidenced in this country by our report and by other evidence, and in the United States by evidence from within the Congress there too. So these are issues that we've been highlighting, and the government has chosen not to address because it hasn't changed the law to reflect the massive change in the electoral landscape, which has been caused by online campaigning and also by the involvement from abroad.
The fundamental problem, and I'll be brief because I'm already late for the news and I don't want to detain you any longer, but the fundamental problem, of course, is that nobody listening to this programme thinks that they were manipulated into voting in any way as a result of disinformation or Russian infiltration, and there'll be very few politicians prepared to stand up in public and say, you know what, I don't want this. I think I might have won it unfairly.
Yeah, so why are they spending a fortune on social media campaigning, which will be the most the biggest area of investment by all the political parties in the election. And why was it that Dominic Cummings was so keen to spend so much money in the last few days of the 2016 referendum on social media campaigning? It's because it works, and it has had a massive impact on this country in the period since 2016, and we see that in the contentious, in the confrontational, in the polarized political environment that we have today, which is fed by this monster which has become the social media campaigns. And we're going to see it through to December the 12th because the government has chosen not to do anything about it.
Ian Lucas, many thanks indeed for your time today. Philip and Bill, can you stay with us a little longer? Is that okay? Excellent stuff. So we'll take some news headlines now, then we'll return with Philip Davis and Bill Browder. And Dominic Grieve will be joining us on the line as well, of course, the chair of that ICS, that Intelligence and Security Committee. It's 10:32, where I am joined by Professor Philip Davis, who's director of the Brunel Centre for Intelligence and Security Studies, and Bill Browder, the architect and prime mover behind the Magnitsky Act, which seeks to limit the activities of Kremlin-friendly oligarchs in freer societies, chiefly in the West, of course. I'm now joined. Is Dominic Grieve ready on the line? I will also be joined by the chair of that select committee during this segment of the programme. It's interesting, the government, I should read another statement from the government that's come in. During this election, we have a coordinated structure in place working with relevant organisations so that we can identify and respond to emerging issues and protect the safety and security of our democratic processes. The government cannot rush this process at the risk of undermining our national security. Again, I'm reduced just to reading out these statements because they've declined to let us talk to anybody. It's interesting that the previous statement, Philip Davis, referred to a lack of evidence of successful intervention. Successful is an interesting word there.
It's very worrying because that's kind of a weasel word that dodges the problem. So you can almost say, well, they haven't successfully altered the election. How do you measure that? How do you measure success? Now, if you can go along and say, well, we can demonstrate some significant impact, you might not be able to show that it tipped the scales, but, you know, it's affecting the tone of debate, the pitch of debate. You might possibly try and look at opinion polling before and after certain items of information operations hit the media. But assigning a metric is very, very hard. The point really here isn't did they change the outcome? The question, was their presence and impact significant enough that the outcome needs to be in doubt? In other words, in the sense of a conviction, was the referendum unsafe? And that moves a lot of ballgames because then it does mean that we're going forward into an election which may be secure now.
Sure.
The horse is already bolted. But where the issue on which the election is resting may be constitutionally and procedurally unsafe.
And I just want to stress here, that's actually bad news for both major parties.
It is, because both of those parties are effectively committed to Brexit. And if there's a reason to have doubt about the fidelity of the referendum and the result it generated because of Russian and or possibly other intervention, then it's a situation where both of them are both going to, one, an election on false premises or erroneous premises, and two, doing so potentially at the bidding of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and the Russian government.
Bill, why would it be, if the central mission here is simply to hang on to as much of the moolah as possible and be free to spend it everywhere from Saint-Tropez to San Francisco, why would Brexit bother the Kremlin?
Well, it feeds into a fundamental issue for Vladimir Putin, which is that he's not that powerful against large groups of entities, but he's incredibly powerful against individual countries. And so he hates the European Union, he hates NATO, he hates the United States, because those are all three entities that can stand up to him. And however, Vladimir Putin loves situations where he can go and pick off Hungary or pick off the Estonia or pressure Germany.
This is why he'd be very spooked by the prospect of Ukraine becoming part of a larger body.
The larger the grouping, the less power he has to bully, pick off, and do his criminal activities. And this feeds into his criminal activities because he doesn't want the West standing up to him and his criminal kleptocracy. And as a result, anything he can do to break up NATO and break up the European Union is in his strong, publicly stated interest. And so, whether you want Brexit or don't want Brexit, Putin wants Brexit because Britain is one of the large and important countries in the European Union, and if you could break it out of the European Union, it means the European Union is a little bit less important, and it also means that Britain can be bullied more than it could be if it was part of the European Union, and that is important for us.
Philip?
I've got 2 points to make on that. First one is that not only is it a question of breaking Britain out, but Britain is one of the few states in Europe that has pushed to a very, very strong line vis-à-vis Russian excesses and for sanctions and so forth. If they can crack us out of the common security and foreign policy of the European Union, that weakens the European Union, makes it less likely to resist Russia, so you gain on that. And the other point is that we have to keep in mind that to a certain degree the Russians don't view the EU and NATO as being entirely separable entities. They're part of a common alliance infrastructure in the West.
Which members don't look at them like that, but Russia does.
But Russia does.
Okay.
And importantly, the NATO in particular is featured in their 2014 defense doctrine as the principal security threat to Russia after terrorism.
What does that mean?
That means essentially they certainly claim, I don't know how much they believe,
Sure.
that they are being encircled by a Western alliance and its wider allies globally, which is continuing to be aggressive and hostile towards Russian interests. And it's about trying to reassert almost a Brezhnev-style sphere of influence.
Bill, one of the lines I saw in the government's comments and responses here is that the leaving of the European Union, beyond the transfer of existing EU regimes into a new UK legal framework, the UK will establish a UK global human rights, and they use Magnitsky in brackets, sanctions regime once we leave the EU, giving us the powers to impose sanctions in response to serious human rights abuses around the world. There's some semantics at play there, but I think the suggestion is presumably that we would have to leave in order to do this.
Well, this is the position that they've always taken. So the Magnitsky Act in the UK...
Which for the avoidance of doubt, the Magnitsky Act is your work. It's your life's mission now, really.
So 10 years ago, after Sergei Magnitsky was murdered in a Russian prison, Sergei was my lawyer, I put aside all of my business activities and became a full-time activist for justice to go after the people who killed him. And then that led to the passage of the Magnitsky Act in the United States and Canada, and then ultimately here in the UK. And the United States has sanctioned more than 50 people. Canada has sanctioned a number of people. And after the Magnitsky Act was passed in the UK, no people were sanctioned. And I was banging the tables and saying, you know, if you're going to be so tough after Salisbury and Skripal, why aren't you sanctioning anybody? And the common response from the government was, we have to wait until we leave the European Union. And I thought, well, that's pretty convenient to say, but it doesn't quite work because the other three countries that have Magnitsky Acts are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They all are part of the European Union. They've all sanctioned people, so what's going on here? And I mean, I will be delighted when when the Magnitsky Act is finally implemented. It's interesting and curious that the main person who is my ally in Parliament on the backbench to pass the Magnitsky Act was Dominic Raab. And he was, and will probably, if the Conservatives win, be Foreign Secretary, and he will implement the Magnitsky Act. But I would have liked to have them do it long before now, and it's a really important thing. And the Russians are terrified of this.
I'm obviously inundated with people who are still very supportive of the idea of leaving the European Union, who are adamant that nothing swayed their vote. None of this is particularly relevant. There's going to be partisanship and a sort of upshot of the binary nature of the referendum. But the key phrase, I think, Philip Davis, here is Russian strategic interests.
It's two things. It's Russian strategic interests and Russian intervention in support of this interest. I think this is not to do with pro-leave, pro-remain. You can be pro-leave, but if you're going to be pro-leave, you have to be ensured that any decision to that effect has been made with a process that has reliable fidelity, that you know it's a legitimate decision. So even if you come with, well, you know, yes, I'm not happy with the European Union for various reasons, you still have the problem, which is if you're going to make a big change like that, you want to make sure you're doing it for your own reasons, that it's not the result of any intervention. The problem about the reason it matters to have Dominic Grieve on, and the reason the ISC report matters, is that unlike the Media and Culture report, which is largely about comparatively overt, comparatively traceable influence,
of course,
an intelligence report is about the activities of the intelligence agencies as a counterintelligence operation attacking and penetrating Russian clandestine intervention efforts. Now, if there's any clandestine intervention campaign going on, that's a damn sight more alarming than a bunch of Russians overtly sponsoring websites or buying themselves some politicians. And if that's the case, and I think that's why, if one of the reasons why it's not being released is because there may be a measure of alarm in the government about what it might say and how it might influence the tone of the election and issues of fidelity of process, is that it puts in a situation where, but if you doubt the process, then you're going into a situation where you're not only taking terrible risks nationally, you're also playing into Russia's hands on grounds that you cannot be sure were made with, and I keep using this phrase, fidelity. This is why ISC report matters, because if you've got reason to believe that it's the Russians back to their old Cold War tricks, and frankly, having senior figures...
Do you have reason to believe that based on your research?
Yes, absolutely. The Estonians, of course, are just now recovering from one of the worst spy scandals from the Cold War in the form of a man called Metsavas, who is an officer in the Lithuanian military, an ethnic Russian, so it plays into all kinds of problems, who leaked massive amounts of very important NATO material. It's been written up in Atlantic Journal. It's in the public domain. But they've got a very concrete, recent reason to worry. The Russians, of course, as we know, are sponsoring things. We know that certain groups that have been identified on cyber influence are run out of either the GRU, Russian Military Intelligence, or out of the SVR, which is their foreign intelligence agency, and probably also FSB, because the domestic agency, because they go everywhere. And so consequently, if you're looking at something going back to Cold War-style disinformation and manipulation of the process, people won't know they've been influenced. They won't see the influence at work because it's being handled clandestinely. You can see the adverts, you can see the press, people making statements, but you don't know what's behind them. Right. It's one thing to come and say, well, we know there are a bunch of Russian IP addresses. You know something? If I'm the FSB, I'm going to use proxy spoofing. I'm going to use proxy. I'm going to use IP spoofing. It's going to be somewhere in Hong Kong. It's not going to be somewhere in Russia, and that's what we're worried about.
And I'm going to choose my words very carefully, but Bill and I were witness to an extremely prominent and respected Russian dissident recently, but I think we're bound by Chatham House rules, so I won't say more. But he knows of what he speaks, and he stated that when he sees Vladimir Putin, of course, as a KGB officer, was a precursor of the FSB, he sees Vladimir Putin look at Donald Trump. He recognises the look. He said that's how a KGB officer looks at an asset.
Yeah, the body language, the way he smiles at him, it's certainly...
I was expecting you to dismiss that out of hand.
No, I mean, he wasn't a very good KGB officer, but he was a KGB officer.
He wasn't, was he? That's one of the interesting things about him. It's a sliding doors moment almost, isn't it, where he would have ended up in relative, complete obscurity.
He was in a very strange position, which he worked the foreign branch, which was used to the elite, but he was based in East Germany. So he never got outside of the USSR, and he never saw the Soviet bloc and never saw the wider world. So he's not a particularly useful KGB officer.
But still, you recognise that.
But he's there. He has the body language. I can see why, especially a Russian case stuff would say, I recognise that.
Good grief. Professor Philip Davies, thank you so much for your time. I'm delighted to have made your acquaintance. I hope we'll talk again. Bill, you can stay with us for a little longer, because I want to talk a little, or I want you to talk a little about the awards ceremony tonight that commemorates your lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was killed in the most grim of circumstances by Kremlin goons, effectively. It's 10:49. Just struggling to raise Dominic Grieve at the moment, but we'll talk to him as and when his train comes in, either metaphorical or actual. But delightfully, it gives me an opportunity to tell you about an event that's unfolding in London tonight, of which Bill Browder is once again the architect, and which commemorates the memory of the lawyer that you've heard mention of throughout the programme, and indeed throughout the last few years on this programme, Sergei Magnitsky. Before we talk about the awards themselves, Bill, just briefly, and of course I've interviewed you about this a few times on various podcasts which are still available, but if we could do a thumbnail sketch of who Sergei was and what happened to him.
So Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia. I was in Russia for 10 years. I was the largest foreign investor in Russia, running an investment fund. I discovered massive corruption in the companies I invested in. I thought the only way of trying to stop it was to expose the corruption through the international media, which I did. And that raised the ire of Vladimir Putin. I was expelled from the country, declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided. And when my offices were raided, they took a bunch of documents away. And those documents were used to perpetrate a very complex fraud where the Russian authorities stole $230 million of taxes that I had paid to the Russian government. They stole it from the Russian government. And Sergei was my lawyer who investigated this crime. He figured it out. He testified against the officials involved, and in retaliation, he was arrested by the same officials he testified against, put in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. And they did some horrific things to him, putting him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and leaving lights on 24 hours a day, putting him in cells with no heat in December and winter in Moscow, nearly froze to death. Cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. And they were doing all this stuff to him to get him to withdraw his testimony. He refused to withdraw his testimony. The pressure got worse and worse. He got real sick. He lost 20 kilos and ended up being diagnosed as having pancreatitis, needing an operation. They refused him an operation, and he got sicker and sicker. He started desperately requesting medical attention. They denied him medical attention. And then on the night of November 16th, 2009, 10 years ago, he was in critical condition. Instead of putting him in an emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him to death. And when I got the news the next morning of his murder, it was the most heartbreaking, traumatic, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. And he'd still be alive today if he hadn't been my lawyer. And I've made it my life's work for the last 10 years. I put aside everything else I'm doing, and I've devoted my life to going after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And we haven't gotten justice in the form of people prosecuted for torture and murder, but we have gotten justice in the form of a piece of legislation which goes after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who do other such things, where we freeze their assets and ban their visas. It's called the Magnitsky Act. It exists in 6 countries. And Vladimir Putin hates this more than anything. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to try to have it repealed, because Vladimir Putin is a Russian human rights violator. He's extremely rich, and he keeps his money offshore. And this puts his money at risk. And he's a guy who values money more than human life. And so if we can go after his money, which we're doing, that's the most devastating thing that can happen to him.
And it's led to you becoming a human rights campaigner on issues well beyond Russia. The first iteration of the Magnitsky Awards a few years ago was very Russia-centric, very Russia-specific. Tonight, at a central London location, you'll be inviting 6 more people to join the sort of annals of Magnitsky laureates. But the Russia connection is no longer specific or exclusive.
Well, so the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, and it was just for Russian human rights violators. And it was passed in the United States first. And the 2 senators who were crucial to the whole thing said to themselves, well, look how mad Putin got at this, because Putin just blew his top. And they thought, well, we should go after other dictators with this. And they came up with something called the Global Magnitsky Act, and that was passed in 2016, and that's the version that we have here in the UK. And what it means is that bad guys from China and Venezuela and Iran and all sorts of places can be sanctioned. And so we also have every year when Sergei, on the anniversary of Sergei's murder, we have a Magnitsky Prize, where we award to brave human rights activists, lawyers, and journalists who have done things in the spirit of Sergei Magnitsky. And we've decided to broaden the Magnitsky Awards to honor international heroes. And tonight we have some unbelievable heroes. If I have time, I'd like to tell a couple brief stories. We have a woman named Gulchera Hoja. She's a Uyghur from the Xinjiang region of China, and she was working for an American radio station, and she was one of the people who exposed the concentration camps in China. And in retaliation, they arrested 40 members of her family and extended family.
40.
40.
This is the Chinese government.
The Chinese government. And she has stood up, and she continues to expose the crimes of the Chinese regime against her people. And there's more than 1 million people in concentration camps in China as they try to ethnically eradicate the Uyghur people. And that kind of bravery I have to just salute and acknowledge and give her a voice so that people know this terrible story.
And another award, tragically, is posthumous.
Another award is, and one of the crimes that has absolutely shocked, moved, and really enraged me is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who exposed lots of terrible things going on in Saudi Arabia. And tonight we're going to be giving the award to him posthumously. His fiancée, who stood outside the embassy while he was being butchered is going to be coming to accept the award on his behalf. And it's really important that we do not forgive and we do not forget what the Saudi government did to Jamal Khashoggi.
Bill Browder, I shall see you this evening. Thank you so much for your time today. It's 11 o'clock. They seek him here, they seek him there. They seek the former Attorney General everywhere. Dominic Grieve, unable to join us as we discussed elements of the Intelligence and Security Committee report authored by the committee, of course, which he until recently headed. But I'm delighted to say he joins us on the line now. We had a fascinating hour of conversation, Dominic. I shall send you the tapes. But
Thank you.
You're very welcome. But I mean, speaking to Bill Browder, the architect of the Magnitsky Act, Philip Davis from Brunel, and indeed to Ian Lucas, who sat on the DCMS, as you know, and yet still despite the accumulation of suggestions to the contrary, still the official government line is that they can't publish this report because it hasn't been properly scrutinised and there isn't time to go through it.
Well, that argument, I'm afraid, simply doesn't stack up. You've got to understand that this report was ready by the committee in late March, and then what happens is that we go through a thing called a redaction and checking process, and that's a dialogue with the intelligence agencies and with the National Security Secretariat to make sure, firstly, that we've got nothing wrong and that the content is factually correct and agreed. And secondly, to make sure that what needs to be redacted, that's blanked out in the interests of national security or removed, can be done so that it is in a form where it can then be published and put before the public. And it's a well honed down process. It goes in two stages. The first is written. The second is, if necessary, we have an oral discussion to try and get it in publishable form. And in the end of it, by early October, we had the approval of the National Security Secretariat and the agencies that this did not in any way compromise or endanger operational national security. And finally, it then goes to the Prime Minister for what is generally a completely straightforward sign-off. And the accepted time for that to be done is 10 days. There's sometimes a tiny bit of slippage. Everybody knew by mid-October, when we sent it in, the 17th, there was a risk of an election, and that our desire to get it out, because we cannot lay this report when the committee doesn't exist. And the Prime Minister has never provided any credible explanation as to why this report has not been passed by him. And the arguments put forward, it takes 6 weeks to look at the redaction process, is just completely and totally wrong.
Of course, in the absence of what you would describe as a credible explanation from the Prime Minister, others move into the vacuum that leaves. Pertinently, perhaps, Oliver Bullock, the author of Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back, a seasoned Russia watcher. He wrote yesterday, someone in Downing Street calculated that it was less embarrassing to suppress the Intelligence and Security Committee's report into Russian interference in the UK than it was to publish it. I wonder whether you'd agree with that.
I'm in no position to say, because I'm not going to divulge the content of this report. I'm really not. I mean, it's a classified document. It's a criminal offence to divulge the content until it's declassified.
Right.
And although, in my view, it is perfectly capable of declassification, for the reasons I've given, because it's been passed through the scrutiny of the intelligence agencies, who, interestingly, said publicly that had happened, which is slightly unusual.
Yes.
I can't comment on the content, and therefore the reasons why the Prime Minister has chosen to take this, to my mind, pretty ridiculous course of action, I simply don't know.
And yet, of course, if it is published after a general election, regardless, I suppose, of how that election unfolds, the calculation might be that it would therefore lose some of its weight. I'm conscious that you can't discuss its contents or attendant issues, but I mean, just applying Occam's razor to the notion of delay, it can't be suppressed indefinitely, can it, or can it?
It could be, because firstly, the Prime Minister could refuse to publish it and say in December that he's decided to exercise his right of veto and it will never come out.
Right.
But secondly, normally this report belongs to the committee. So it's the committee which lays the report before Parliament. And in those circumstances, what one would normally expect is that the committee's secretariat go and lay the report, and we can't do that when we don't have a committee. And last time, the committee didn't even get reformed for nearly 6 months after the general election. So I can easily see a situation where this is kicked into the long grass well into the late spring. And
Right.
that, I think, is very unsatisfactory.
And then it would emerge not with a bang, perhaps, but with a whimper.
Well, it might. It is certainly then getting quite old and stale, and things may have moved on for all I know. I mean, this committee, I want to explain.
Yes, please.
This committee is a bipartisan. Currently, there are 4 Conservatives, 3 Labour, 1 SNP and 1 crossbench peer, and there are 2 members of the House of Lords in all, and the rest are members of the House of Commons. Anybody who sat in on our meetings would be unable to tell
Yes.
who is belongs to what party, and for that matter, the sort of Remain-Leave element which has been dragged into this is completely irrelevant to our proceedings. So we do our best to do scrutiny of the agencies, to publish reports which are helpful and informative to the public to understand some of the threats the UK is facing, and whether we have the right systems in place to deal with it. That's our task. It's not to engage in firework displays. It's to do sensible, measured work. And that's what, in my view, we have done with this report, and I think it is in the national interest that it's published. Russia's threat is well recognised. Electoral matters, it's much wider ranging than that, but because we do know that Russia has sought to interfere in elections elsewhere, the bit that we've done on elections and subversion of the democratic process is, I think, informative and very useful for the public, and I would like to see that out. I would have liked to have seen that out before a general election.
Do you think there's any chance that you will?
Well, I don't think so, because we don't have a committee to publish it.
No.
Somebody has suggested to me that the government might choose to publish it itself, although what its status would then be, I'm really not sure. If I thought there was some way by which the government might now repent that people could be sensibly informed, I would certainly be prepared to consider it. But it does present some difficulties. I'm happy to discuss that with my own ex-secretariat, but you've got to understand,
Yes, of
I'm
course.
not even chairman of this committee anymore.
No, well, yeah, you're not, of course, even an MP at the moment. But final question. As you survey your career, both political and legal, where would you rate the importance of the committee report?
Well, this is an important report on an important subject, and it is there to provide guidance to the public, to issues or areas where improvement may be needed, to highlight areas of risk to the United Kingdom, and to identify, where possible, what may or may not have happened in the past. Transparency of this sort is always useful for the public, and indeed ultimately it's useful for government. And bear in mind, of course, that the government will get a classified version of this report, which will go into a great deal more detail of some things that can't be put into the public domain at all. And so it serves a useful purpose within government. And all this at the moment has been stymied by the Prime Minister without, in my view, any good reason. If he'd had a good reason, I would have expected him to have contacted me before the election Parliament was dissolved, to have had me into Downing Street and to have explained to me and my secretariat, and through me to my members, what the problem was that was preventing publication. And the fact is that never happened.
Which leaves many people listening to conclude perhaps that they prefer speculation to revelation. But as you remind us, you couldn't possibly comment.
Yes.